It's great to be here with the small task of setting up a conversation entitled, Can We Trust Tech? Our study, and this is the methodology slide so that you know that it's serious and you can't ask me methodology questions, is the largest study of its kind in the world where we have for 19 years looked at the topic of trust. We do not define trust. We ask a simple question and have for 19 years. How much do you trust the institution of government, of media, of NGO, and of business to do the right thing? To do the right thing. 80% of the respondents in China trust the media to do the right thing. Right? There you go. That's the reaction, because we come at that from what is the role of the New York Times? If I'm a Chinese national, which is who I asked that about the media in China, who owns the media in China? The state. What's the role of the media in China? To move the message of the state. Why would I think the media would not do the right thing if that was my perspective of the institution in China? So bear that in mind as we look at this data, right? You've got to be in the mindset of the respondents. We're going to look at two fundamental segments. We call them informed public and mass population. What we mean by informed is 25 to 64, college educated, and the top household earners, top household income in that market. So think of informed public as haves, and think of mass populations as have less, not have-nots. And that becomes relevant in some contrast that you see starting on this slide, where we look at this past year's data compared to the year before, and we see a slight increase in trust across the board. I would posit that that's because it had nowhere to go but up based on where it was in 2018. The top would be the haves. The general population at the bottom would be the have less. You can see a distinction between, say, the trust in business. 7 out of 10 informed public trust business this year, whereas 56% of the general population, right? So two different worldviews if you look at those haves at the top with, in the 60s, upper 50s, and then you look at the general population at the bottom, upper 50s, even, 40, 47, 47 as it relates to government and media. Media, the least trusted of the four institutions. Distrusted in 18 of the 27 markets where we poll. So I'll let Nick address that as a journalist when he comes up next. We're exploring and focusing on trust in tech, though. So if that's the stage setter at a global level, let's look at the difference in the 27 markets. This is just the composite average of the trust in those four institutions across the 27 markets that we have. The left-hand side, the informed public, the haves. The right-hand side, the mass population, or the have a little less, right? The blue bubble on the right shows you the number of markets in which that trust level is 60 or above. Look at the contrast in the blue bubble on the left and the orange bubble on the right, right? That less income, that less informed public, much less trusting. And it's against that backdrop that we look at this, which is the 2019 findings as it relates to trust in sectors. The most trusted sector in the world, according to our study, is technology. 78%, 3-point increase. Everything rose, so I would posit that this wasn't some behavioral thing that happened within these industries. This was an increase in trust year over year, and therefore we see an increase in sector trust year over year. I do not delineate in the questionnaire between hardware and software. I do not define a technology company. I do not give an example when I say trust technology to do the right thing. Trust this sector of technology to do the right thing. From the time that we have started the sector's exploration, which has been 12 years of the 19, tech has always been the most trusted sector. That depth of that trust, so we ask that question around trust to do the right thing on a 9-point scale. And the point of this slide is the box on the left, bless you, is the developed markets, where you see a much weaker level of trust in those developed markets. What I mean by that is if I'm asking you that trust level on a 9-point scale, I'm saying that 8, 9 is strong trust, 6, 7, weak trust. Compare the light blue bars on the left to those on the right from a market-by-market comparison standpoint, right? So while the trust level's high at 78 global, a deeper dive into understanding that level of trust shows that in developed markets, it's a weaker base. And that fundamentally comes from this notion that 5 in 10 respondents believe that technology is happening too fast and they're being left behind. Like, just this pace of change is overwhelming, and no one is taking care. It's not that these changes are going to help me. This pace of change is leaving me and my family behind. And as it relates to these technology companies, only 55% actually believe that they are doing sufficiently as it relates to protecting customer data. And even less, or 49%, believe that tech is putting the welfare of customers ahead of its own profits. Now, remember that slide with the box with the weaker trust? If I just look at those markets, look at the far right-hand side, only 39% of those respondents believe that tech is putting welfare of customer ahead of profit. So in those developed markets where you could argue that the system in which technology is working and supporting those societies, there's a greater sense of disbelief as it relates to tech as helping the welfare of those customers. There's an incredible concern. 65% believe that technology companies have too much power in determining what news people see or don't see. We've asked a question for 2 years about news and information as a weapon, and we have 80% of respondents globally across 27 markets who are concerned that information can be used as a weapon against their country. We also look at a difference here in types of media from a technology standpoint: traditional, search, online only, owned, and social. So this delineation, and in this instance, we actually do define. So when we field in Indonesia, we work locally to give examples of each of those types of media in the market of Indonesia so there's no confusion. And what you see here is a strong resurgence in trust in traditional media, and you see at the bottom of this pile the social media trust. I think an interesting point here, and an interesting point in this conversation as it relates to trust in technology companies, is the opportunity as it relates to owned media, right? So what Microsoft.com can posit into the conversation, an 8-point increase in that trust in owned media year over year. There's an expectation that tech as an industry, that these companies help me understand the impact of these emerging technologies. And here you can see that that's about 56% of the respondents believe that. One of the interesting data cuts on that is that second bar where you see that circle, is that number jumps to 63%, or nearly 2 out of 3 tech employees who are currently employed in the industry believe that their own employers are not doing enough to prepare the world for this evolution. Again, a contrast between the global respondent set and the tech employees as it relates to the role that companies should play in ensuring that the education system keeps pace, right? So again, a strong belief that they should be doing that, a higher expectation from the employees in the industry, as well as, I think, a fairly positive perspective I take from industry employees who believe that their companies are, or 2 in 3, believe that those companies are working proactively with government to shape policy. Those tech employees have high expectations. In this Techlash story that's growing, the walkout at Wayfair just yesterday, the latest example of that from an expectation standpoint, 71% of those tech employees expect that there's opportunity in their job to engage in opportunities that are going to address social and societal problems. 80% expect that those jobs are going to allow them to reflect their values, and 3 in 4 believe that their CEO, their tech CEO, should actively lead in these conversations that are most challenging to our times. So I want to pivot before I close on why does trust matter. This is new data from this year where we said, what are the deal breakers or deciding factors for you as a consumer in deciding what to purchase? After product attributes, I must be able to trust the brand to do what is right, is the next most important factor. The next most important factor behind product attributes is trust. We think a pretty interesting insight. And that, as it relates to that deciding factor, is not a millennial phenomenon. It's not a male-female phenomenon. It's not an east-west phenomenon, just based on this snapshot that you can see. And so despite that expectation that they have to be able to trust the brand to do what is right, there is a seeming failure in the sense that only 1 in 3 actually believe that most of the brands that they buy, they actually trust. So we're back to that fickle consumer mentality, right? Of like, this matters, but yet I only trust 1 in 3 of my brands. So the notion of trust is a fundamental currency that I think has never been more important than it is today. And I think at the eye of the storm, if you will, in this trust conversation, is the subsequent discussion we're going to have today around this industry. So, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Some amazing data there. I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm the editor of Wired. I know he just said that people don't trust the media, but you know who I'm going to interview next? A lawyer. I'd like to welcome one of my favorite people in this business, Tim Wu. He is a professor at Columbia Law School. He is the author of a new book that many of you have read, which is fantastic, called The Curse of Bigness. Please welcome Tim to the stage. What's going on? All right, so Tim has an IQ of about 200, so I'm just going to start with a hard question about trust that I've been thinking about, and then we're going to move into antitrust.
Nice.
All right, so my question about trust. People don't trust stuff on the internet anymore. Right? They don't, in fact, maybe even trust news about elections. They no longer maybe should even trust what they see on Amazon because there is so much fake stuff and there's so much fraud. That's fine. We all know that's bad. We all want to get rid of it. My colleague Zainab Tufekci has made an interesting argument that if you look at the world, there are high-trust societies like Aspen, where I just left my bag with my wallet and my cell phone, and I'm pretty sure nobody's going to steal it. And they're low-trust societies. And in low-trust societies, they tend towards dictatorship, and they tend towards authoritarianism. And so Zainab's argument is that the loss of trust on the internet is going to lead us to a more authoritarian society and more authoritarian internet. Is that true?
You know, I think she is onto something. I agree with you. I always like places where you see bikes unlocked, which is Aspen's an example of that as well. And I think the early internet had a lot of those characteristics. Craigslist. I remember in the 90s, I went looking for an apartment on Craigslist, and there's Craig, and everyone felt they could trust him, and it was just like a community. Now, systems get bigger, and invariably. There's a transition, and people can see the opportunity in fraud and so forth. And I think that has happened. And I do worry that it supports the argument, the ones that you're suggesting, that no, we have to have just a series of really big companies that can take care of this all, because there's problems with that as well. As someone who worked in government for quite some time, I think part of this is a big failing of government. Real governments. So I want to ask one question. Why is it we're still getting these robocalls 5 times a day if we have a government that has a monopoly on force and knows how to fight fraud? What's going on? Why has not the nuisances, the fraudsters of our time, felt the steel of law enforcement? We actually have misdirected our law enforcement resources, in my view. This comes from working in state law enforcement, where I felt we had so much fraud, so much fakery going on when I worked for the New York Attorney General. You could have tripled us by 10 times the number of agents and still had stuff to do. So I see this partially as a problem, but it is a problem, and I don't think the answer is, oh, well, this is just why we have to give all the power to Amazon, Facebook, and Google and have them deal with all the problems. As systems get bigger, you do need to have stronger enforcement mechanisms, but I think that part of this is a failure of government.
I'd actually would add on to that with robocalls, that if I put on my cynical hat, I might suggest the reason we have robocalls is that we have a monopoly telecom system, and they actually profit off robocalls because it takes up more minutes. And so therefore, there's a disincentive, and there's not a competitive market, so you can't have a competitor provider who knocks out all the robocalls. But that is a digression. Let's talk.
No, I like talking about government. I know I got to.
By the way, turn off your phone so you don't get any robocalls during this panel.
No, I think government needs to be responsive to what people feel in their daily life. Robocall is just an example, but this idea that you can't trust things, even the big platforms, more In the old days, I feel like when you searched on Amazon, for example, you had a sense you knew it was going into the search and maybe it was a product. Now it's really mysterious. And you don't know who's paying to get higher up in the search rankings. You don't know if it's always Amazon's own product. You don't know what's going on. It's illegal to give people a search it's a violation of consumer protection laws that is not honest. That you don't give the criteria as to where it is. But so many of our searches have become kind of crooked, and you don't know what's going on. And I think it fosters the lack of trust. I point the finger at consumer protection, law enforcement is one of them, but also the internal ethics of the companies. And that's another big story, and maybe
well, we're about to get into it.
All right.
So what I want to do on antitrust, Tim, how many people here saw Zuckerberg yesterday? Show of hands.
Good.
Wow. All right. So I won't rehash what he said. Or I actually am going to. So what I'm going to do here, I am going to present the arguments that Mark Zuckerberg gave on antitrust in the fairest way I can, and I'm going to have Tim respond. So it will be a little bit like Tim being on stage yesterday. And I've written like 50,000 words about Facebook in the last 2 years, so I can kind of internalize their arguments reasonably well. So Mark made 2 arguments yesterday, and he often makes a third, and Cheryl makes this argument too. So I'm going to give you the 3 arguments that they make when the subject of antitrust comes up. Number 1, if you break the large platforms into smaller companies, they will not compete on the stuff you want. They won't compete on making their platforms safer. They won't compete on privacy. They will only compete on the stuff you don't want, which is unadulterated growth. And if you have smaller platforms, they won't be able to do the things like hire 30,000 people to find all the bad stuff on Facebook. That is argument number 1. Argument number 2. If you break up the large American tech companies, you will give an advantage to China. Because there are certain technologies where you need large tech companies. For example, artificial intelligence, which requires massive data sets and massive compute, which you only have at the large tech companies. And it's not like China is going after Alibaba. And so as we head towards a technological Cold War, the United States government is kicking the tech platforms in the shins, while the Chinese government is just helping their large companies. That's argument number 2. Mark didn't make that yesterday, but he does, and Cheryl makes that argument as well. Number 3, which he made yesterday. You, very specifically, and several other people, have said that the antitrust remedy to Facebook is to split apart Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, to unwind those mergers. You can argue whether they should have been approved or not, but they were approved. You've said unwind them. Yeah. And what Mark said yesterday is, hey, sometimes mergers are bad, no question. But these mergers were not. Instagram had 13 employees when they bought it. It didn't have an Android app. It was nothing. Without Facebook, Instagram doesn't become what it is. It has become much more innovative because of Facebook, and the same can be said of WhatsApp. And so you would be splitting off things that wouldn't have been, those mergers should not have been stopped because those things would not have become competitive platforms without Facebook's help. So therefore, that is unjustified, and it would be bad for innovation overall. So if you could take on those 3 arguments, we'll go through them.
Very pleased to. Let me take a preface here and talk about what my greater mission is here. I believe that we need to reinvigorate a great American tradition. That is the tradition of antitrust. I think we have lost some of our pioneering spirit. I believe that it's been a long part of the American tradition to believe in competition, believe in competitive markets, and that Americans have always kind of rebelled against concentrated power. That's a big part of the Constitution, is try to divide up power and make sure no one has too much. And it's a big part of what we did in 1890 and 1914, and also in 1950, is pass antitrust laws, the goals of which were to put some controls on private power and to keep markets competitive and prevent them from just becoming 2 or 3 big players. So that's my big mission. That's the curse of bigness, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm happy to take those arguments on in reverse order. The first is the easiest in some ways. Mark Zuckerberg wrote an email when he was acquiring Instagram. The email was disclosed in the New York Post, which suggested that he was buying Instagram because he saw them as a competitive threat. He believed that they were a threat to their competition. It is a felony in the United States law to buy companies off that you believe are competitive threats to you. And so he was actually acting in a way which was clearly illegal when he bought off Instagram. The idea that Instagram would be nothing without the infusion of Facebook's capital is untrue. Instagram already had enormous amounts of venture finance capital, venture finance funding. They were kind of rolling in money. Not only that, but I think this is more important. What Mark Zuckerberg didn't mention was that Twitter was trying to buy Instagram to turn Instagram into a Facebook killer. Instagram was the most dangerous company for Facebook. Facebook had already destroyed a company like it, MySpace, earlier on in the same pattern. Instagram was poised to do very similar things to them. There was two reasons. First of all, they were much stronger on mobile. Second of all, they were better at photo sharing. They had, as a commentator said at the time, they had Facebook's Achilles heel. They were the most dangerous threat for Facebook. The American way, what we believe in competition, is that companies should fight it out, not buy each other when there's a serious competition. We established that principle with the Standard Oil Company. The problem with Standard Oil was they went out and bought every single oil company so that there was no competition. And the purchase of Instagram was, in terms of intent and in terms of effect, an illegal transaction. So I don't think saying they only had 14 people answers that when you have Twitter wanting to turn them into a Facebook killer. That is, so I submit that argument is wrong. The second argument surrounds China. So basically, in that argument, Facebook is asking to become the regulated monopoly of the United States to do battle with our foreign enemies. I think that this country has always put its faith in competition and innovation instead of our national champions. I do not believe America is a country of national champions. It's actually counter to what we believe in. I will tell you, we faced this problem once before in the 1970s and 80s when Japan was the great threat. Japan was going to out-innovate it. They were smarter. The government wasn't attacking Sony and its companies. No, the government knew how to support them. They had the mysteries of the Orient on their side. Exactly the same scenario. And AT&T, IBM, the great American monopolist, said, yes, you need to support us in our fight with Japan. What did we do? We broke up AT&T. We chased IBM around for anti-competitive conduct. And out of that battle, it turned out that these companies were holding back a lot. Out of IBM's carcass came the personal computer, came the software industry, came this 80s and 90s boom. Out of AT&T's carcass, IBM didn't die, AT&T didn't die, but they were diminished. Their holdover industry was broken. Out of that came a new telecom industry, came a new internet industry, the ISP industry, and all the industries we're worrying about today, that is the industries on top of the internet. So there is a lesson. When we break up stifling monopolies, the result is often more growth, better for the United States, as opposed to, here's our national champions, let's stick with them. I'll tell you two countries that stuck with the national champions program in the 70s and 80s were Europe and Japan. And I haven't heard from either of them in a long time in the tech markets at all. Their problem is they fell in love with this idea that these were the best companies for all time. If we think, okay, Google, Amazon, Facebook, these guys have got it, they figured everything out. Look, they are incredibly impressive companies. And I won't deny that. But 20 years from now, they may not be quite as impressive. 20 years from now, there's going to be something else going on. And if we have intertwined them so carefully into the American fabric that they are the national monopolists, the sort of the undefeatable companies of their kind. And I'll tell you, one thing they'll do is wind themselves into government so they are indisplaceable by the market. So after a while, AT&T is the greatest example of this. 30 years, 40 years late into AT&T's rule over American tech, American telecommunications, it didn't matter if you had a better product. It didn't matter at all. There was no such thing as competing with AT&T. And I think if we leave it in 20 years from now, there'll be no such thing as competing with Facebook or Google. And there will be these companies that are like, remember when those guys were young and they had good ideas and they're just kind of like these tired old companies that don't do anything. So that is the danger I'm warning against. Don't follow lessons of Japan and Europe. Let's follow the lessons of the United States. Challenge our greatest tech companies, force them to compete, and we will continue to be a tech champion in this world. That's number two. We're just getting started. What was number three again?
Number three was Mark's argument that if you break them up, the companies that are started will compete on the stuff you don't like, not the stuff you do like. They will compete on growth. They will not compete on privacy, safety, safe elections, all of that.
Right. I think this again betrays a lack of faith in competition. So Because I've written so much about the history, I have spent a lot of time with the AT&T monopoly, and that's the arguments they always made. They said if you break up AT&T, phone calls won't go through. Long distance has to be $1 a minute to be high quality. This whole idea of a long distance that's 10 cents a minute, that's going to be terrible, right? And so they've always been this sort of fear-mongering that if you challenge the power of the biggest companies, they won't be able to do the things that you want government to do. Also, notice in that argument there's a subtle idea, and it's often appeased toward government as a dangerous sign where big tech starts promising it's going to do government's work for it. So one of the, we're going to provide security, we're going to fight against, the Russians and so forth. So first of all, I don't think Facebook has a good track record of protecting this country against Russian attack and against foreign attack. So if they're promising more of the same, I don't want to hear it. You know what I mean? And I also think anyone who studies systems knows that centralized systems are dangerous because they offer one big giant target. Most people who have studied the problems with Russian interference in the last election suggest that one of the problems is that you just had a couple big targets. I would submit that 20 years ago, in the sort of days of the more chaotic internet, what would you do? Go trying to find people, put some ads on Craigslist or something to try and, to try and manipulate votes? When there are just a few choke points, just a few points of control, that's when you're vulnerable to foreign interference. That's when your security problems rise. There's a reason Microsoft Windows was always the most vulnerable for viruses, because it was the big target. And so I think we are safer with ecosystems rather than centralized monopoly. I think we need to go back to that. And I think it's a terrible thing that we've let the tech sector, which was traditionally the most decentralized, the most innovative, full of just all kinds of competing ideas, but we've come to the point where the idea of tech is you build a great company so you can get bought by Facebook. That is just not the kind of ambitions we should have for young engineers in this country. And so I profoundly disagree with that. I think it portrays a lack of faith in competition, a lack of faith in the ecosystem, and comes back to an idea that trust us, we're going to do it all. Well, we did trust Facebook, and they have not proven worthy of the trust. They blew it last time. They're a recidivist company. I also have a personal beef on this because I worked in the government, and we put Facebook under order for privacy violations, and they violated that order so many times we can't even count it. And so why should we trust a recidivist company to handle the security of a company which ignores government orders to protect privacy, to protect the security of this country? That doesn't make any sense to me. That's why I think we need a shakeup in big tech.
So my basic read on Tim's comments is that he was probably more likely to have given a standing ovation to Common yesterday than Mark Zuckerberg. Let me ask you one follow-up, because we don't have a ton of time, which is you've argued very interestingly that some of the most important antitrust action is not going to come from the DOJ or from the FTC or from Europe. It's going to come from the states. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that argument. Tell me how that is going to shake up, and tell me how that could apply to the large tech giants.
Yeah, there's been a growing tendency, it's a real change, a return to kind of a different spirit of American federalism, where I think the states are starting to see their role as filling in for the federal government when the federal government doesn't do things. Privacy is a good example. A lot of people are concerned about privacy. Congress has done nothing for very long times, with some small exceptions. So California did something, the same way they did with emissions. And I think on some of these issues, the government has, I worked in the Obama administration, and I worked in antitrust, so I'll take some personal blame here. But we have not provided the merger oversight we should have. We have allowed too much consolidation of the economy, and I think it has contributed to a lot of the sense of anger about wealth distribution in this country. So the states are starting to step in. They, this month, stepped in to try to block the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint, which almost anyone can look at and say it's probably going to just increase prices for consumers by billions of dollars.
Robocalls.
And maybe robocalls. I don't know which is worse. Actually, it is bad. These robocall issues not taken seriously enough. Yeah. So the states are firing up. I think the states may be the ones to watch in some of this tech stuff, because the federal government has just not been active.
Can I ask a quick question? It's
Sure.
Aspen Ideas. We spent all this time beating up on Trump. Is it possible to beat up on Obama here? So he approves all of these mergers, right? Instagram happens under his watch. You know, all of the decisions that have put us where we are happen under his watch, and he had 40 ex-Google employees working for his government. Do you think that the Obama administration was captured by big tech?
Captured might be too strong. I would say that maybe sometimes we had an overly rosy view. I think in the early thousands, you know, there was this honeymoon period where everyone loved tech, and you know, and they did build great companies. And it's an American thing to have a lot of faith in the technologies of the future.
79%.
Yeah, exactly. Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, some of these heroes are great inventors. And I think that spirit carried forward. I don't think anyone in the Obama administration was taking money, but we had this kind of rosy view. And when Mark Zuckerberg came to the Federal Trade Commission and said, oh, I'm so sorry about these privacy violations, but like, I'm a young man, I don't know what I was doing, we're never going to do it again. Everybody believed it and dropped individual charges against him. But in fact, we were fooled, I think. I think we had too rosy a view. And I do think that it's time to really take a hard look at how power is allocated. And I say, once again, return to the American traditions, both in tech and in the economy, is that we believe in decentralized ecosystems of innovators going out there to do their own thing. It's the American frontier. And it is an older tradition. It is you know, Theodore Roosevelt, Louis Brandeis. It is what we need to recover, and I think is a big part of our answers going forward to some of the dissatisfaction in this country.
Right, well,
so antitrust, I'm a believer, and there we go.
So Tim, if you sinned during the Obama administration, you have more than done your repentance. I would like to thank Tim Wu for a lot of amazing, and I'd also like to thank him for letting me be Mark Zuckerberg for 5 minutes. Welcome to the stage, Fred Humphries of Microsoft. You have some amazing stuff coming up. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You can trust me in that I am not going to talk about antitrust being for Microsoft. That's one. Two, I love Aspen Institute, but when they had their description on the deep dive, they said trust and then go Google. Moderator from Microsoft, trust, then go Google. I went and tried to trust Google, but then I verified with Bing. That's a good rule for all of you all. We got a really great panel. We're on the clock, 30 minutes. Be a little bit lightning round. We want to have a robust discussion. But you heard what I would say more about weapons. We're going to be talking about tools. We're going to be talking about technology tools for good. I love being affiliated with that. And when we talk about that, we're going to talk about the tools for good with tech and thinking about it from a societal impact perspective. So that's teeing it up, framing it up, and with that, all right, you know, it's tough getting old. I get the glasses out. I got to make sure they're going to be quick introductions. We all know Craig, so I can go on and say Craig. Craig Newmark with Craigslist and Philanthropy Now. Suzan Goldberg with the National Geographic Editor-in-Chief. Evan Barwell. I want to get it right, Evan. Get it right as founder and CEO of Education Superhighway, and Jim Bildner, CEO of Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. Let's start off with the question of, it'd be great just to hear on a little definition of tech for good, as well as anything that you want to talk about from something you've developed or utilize, or something you want to share when it comes from the perspective of tech for good. Why don't we just start with you, Craig, and then come around and hear from each person.
I've been working with specific technology for some time. Quick examples. Right now in a lot of cities, you could take your smartphone, point it at a pothole, and ask for it to be fixed. I work with a lot of vets groups, families groups. They can use video phone conferencing. That is, families can talk to their deployed service members across the world to see how they're doing. That ain't bad. There's a website I know about that can be used to help you put food on the table, to help you get a table, to help you put a roof under that table. In a bigger sense, there's the Women's Startup Challenge, which is in the process right now of helping hundreds of women-led startups get a much more serious chance at getting funded. That's in the here and now. In the few years to come, there's groups like Girls Who Code, which are training girls in high schools to see what their taste is for technology, if they have careers there, or if they just have a good idea of what's going on there so they know it'll apply to their future businesses. And there's Wikipedia, which is where facts go to live. Used to be problems, they're diminishing rapidly. Even in future investment, there's the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, which is an effort to make sure that computer scientists, programmers, are getting trained in the ethics of the unanticipated challenges associated with what they're building. So I'm pretty impressed with what people who build technology, the engineers, the computer programmers, what they're doing with it. A lot of good is happening. Maybe most important of all, technology can be used to build democratic movements. On the downside, though, those same tools can be weaponized to attack democracy, and that involves people of goodwill and good conscience in technology to work together to counter that. But I think we're slated to talk about more of that in the next few minutes.
That's great. Susan?
Well, at National Geographic, we believe in the ability of stories to change the world, to help use stories to make the world a better place. And I feel like with the technology tools at our disposal, we've got more opportunities to do that, to reach larger and more diverse audiences than we ever have. I mean, most people know us, well, traditionally know us for the magazine. We publish in 33 languages. About 55 million people see that magazine in print or digitally each month around the world. Most people don't know that we're the largest brand on Instagram. We've got 112 million followers on Instagram. We're about to overtake Justin Bieber. We've got Kim Kardashian in our sights. But I really do think it's these ways of telling stories to reach that next generation of readers and users that can make such a difference. We did an issue last year called Planet or Plastic, and it was the beginning of a years-long campaign at National Geographic to get people to cut back on their use of single-use plastic. After we did this campaign really has gone global. There's 20 countries that we publish in that have got active campaigns. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken a pledge to use less plastic. Most of the people who were in touch with us over this campaign, 2/3 of them had never interacted with National Geographic before. So we're using technologies across all of these ways to tell stories to reach audiences that we haven't been able to reach before. So I think it's enormously optimistic for storytellers who want to make a difference.
Good afternoon. At Education Superhighway, we're very focused on how technology and data can be used to improve our public institutions. Our first mission at Education Superhighway was to put high-speed broadband in every public school classroom because we believed that technology could be a force for leveling the playing field in education. And we're seeing that happen. Access in education has gone up dramatically in our rural and inner city communities compared to the kinds of things that our suburban communities were primarily the places you could get it. But we're also focused on what can we do to make the institutions of government better. And we've had an experience where there was a government program. It was spending $2.4 billion a year to put broadband in schools, and pretty much every school had a cable modem. And by leveraging data and technology, by creating transparency around how that money was being spent, what we've seen is a 90% decrease in the cost of internet access for schools, and that's enabled us to see a dramatic increase. So instead of 4 million kids in this country, we now have 46 million kids that have broadband in their classroom. So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to use technology and data to improve our public institutions.
Thanks. I just want to acknowledge, it feels like for a few moments here that we're apologists for technology, and I want to just be clear, everything that was just said and everything that will be said, we see clearly. And in a funny way, we are early stage investors. We funded 155 social enterprises over the past 17 years, about 104 in the last 5.5 years. And those that are having the most impact are in fact using technology, but a lot of them are using SMS technology and text messaging, care message, crisis text line, even Uptrust, which is reminding folks who have a court appearance that they have a court appearance so that they don't fail to appear and they don't get a bench warrant which is a speedy, just a free ticket to jail. So it is important. And now, increasingly, we're actually finding our social enterprises trying to fix the same problems that technology has created. And so, in a time like we live in now, it's so easy to get caught up, not just in noise, because I think if I just said, hey, there's a lot of white noise out there on the bad stuff that is happening, it's not noise, it is happening. But we can't forget how much needs to get done on the ground, and that there are technologies that can be used to really make a difference.
Thank you all. Craig, talk a little bit more as far as, advancing technology when it comes to election interference and disinformation and things of that nature. What are your thoughts, and any tools that are good on a part of technology would be great. Great to hear from you.
There's a number of groups right now looking just how our elections have been manipulated, both by foreign adversaries and their domestic allies. They're trying to figure out how the disinformation is introduced in small groups and small websites, how that goes on to influence larger ones, let's say conspiracy websites, how then the people there play the people in questionable news websites, get that into there, and finally, how the disinformation is brought into mainstream or conventional websites, and how that happens. So part of the solution involves figuring out how that information flows and then stop it as it flows. Another part of the solution is going to be improved journalistic ethics. Specifically, when you're on a news site of some sort, that is when the news people are trying to figure out what's news and not, a lot of the time, they know something is disinformation. They know that it's a pants on fire kind of lie, and yet they run it full bore, even though they know they're amplifying a lie. Right now, there's efforts involved at places like the Poynter Institute and Columbia Journalism, even at the Washington Post, who are trying to figure out how do you ethically report on something without amplifying the lie. That may be the biggest part of things, because if you neutralize the disinformation, that means that it no longer crowds out valid information. Again, the quarrel one has with bad information is not the gray area questionable stuff, but a lot of the lies or other problems with journalism ethics, like false equivalence, like minor problems with mishandling emails is very small compared to much larger crimes. So the application of good journalistic ethics might solve a lot of problems. I can go on for a long time on this. I should stop now.
I want to pick up on something you were saying, Jim, as far as it feels like during this tech lash, tech companies are a little bit doing an apology tour. And I think it's impacting smaller, and a lot of innovation that's taking place. That's for good. What are some of the things that we should be doing to try to figure that out, to help highlight, as each one of you all are doing, as we're talking about tech for good? Any one of you all can take this on, but just curious, because I think that's a real issue of today, and it's sometimes, I think, a little unfortunate for startups and others just to be, lumped in or playing the game of how do I distance myself from there. So
within our portfolio, we see about 1,000 applications a year. We funded last year 20. So I have no worry whatsoever that the sort of appropriate backlash against technology is in any way impeding human desire to make a difference on the ground for vulnerable populations across the globe. So that is not something I worry about. What I do think is that the sources of capital for those organizations is not as robust as it could be, because there is this arms race, particularly in the for-profit side, and I'm talking about venture funding and other financings. Right. I mean, we are probably one of 2 or 3 or 4 funders who fund social enterprises at this level. And it shouldn't be our job to solve for sovereign failure, but it is our job. And so my concern isn't pipeline, my concern is capital. And so that's what I worry about. And a lot of us are trying to figure out ways to pool that capital to be able to address that. And if capital doesn't flow to this, it's only going to compound the issues that Tim and others are worried about. The best antidote against the tech, quote, problem is showing on the ground how technology can be used in real time to make a difference in the lives of millions of people. That will change the discourse.
Suzan, I think you...
I wanted to get back to something that Craig was saying about journalistic ethics. I mean, the truth about it is that technology amplifies journalism, whether that's good journalism or bad journalism. And so, journalists, I came up in the newspaper industry, been a journalist for 40 years, and, there's never been a time when it's been more important for our journalists to be really to be well-trained in the ethics of reporting a story, gathering that information, disseminating that information, understanding fairness, not falling into false equivalencies, and you used to see this a lot over climate change and issues like that. So it's getting our journalists better trained, and frankly, we have had some issues lately in the industry because a lot of people who are practicing journalists now weren't really brought up as journalists. They were more brought up on the tech side. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there are certain conventions in journalism, and they're really important because if we don't have our credibility, we don't have anything to tell people, let alone sell people. But the other part of it is consumers need to be better informed consumers too. And we as an industry, I think, have done a terrible job of helping people understand how to tell real information from information that just smells to high heaven and isn't real. And you often can tell.
And if I could pick up on something that Jim was saying. So I think capital is the right place to look, but it comes down to incentives, right? What are the incentives that new tech entrepreneurs have? And largely their incentives are grow fast and, grow fast and grow fast. And
it's market-based.
It's a market. It's a purely profit-driven market-based incentive.
And if societal impact overlaps, or is that the right way to look at it?
If you look at, go back to when Google came public, and everyone was sort of shocked that in their IPO prospectus they said, "Do no evil," and people in Wall Street were like, "What the heck does this mean?" Right? But think about it. What they said is do no evil. In other words, they weren't saying do good, right? And I think in general, the entire incentive system of Silicon Valley, the tech industry, and everything else is like, we want to grow, we want to create great companies, and along the way, don't do bad things. But we need a shift in perspective where they have incentives not just to not do bad, but to actually do good.
What do you... All right. Let's see if we can get it going there. All right. What do you think about one of the things that was in the poll that we saw about employees? I think it was 71%, I can't remember the exact number, of employees want their CEO or their leader to reflect their values. We see that, and I don't think it's unique to Microsoft, we see that very much. And one of the things that they're focusing on, right? It's not the market-based piece.
Yeah.
It's more, what are you doing? What are the things that we're making and developing that are having societal impact?
That's right.
Any comment on that?
Look, I think that data, if you look at the technology sector, my sense is that data is understated. That actually even every employee who works for me and every employee I know that works in tech, that's like a big deal to them. Like making a difference in the world, having their leaders reflect their values, those are hugely important to them. And in the war for talent, it's incredibly important if you want to get the best people.
Aren't there tensions there? Shareholder value? And then societal? I'm just throwing it out.
For sure. Absolutely there are tensions. But what more and more research that I've seen is showing that if you, and I think the research we saw earlier, if you want to win in the marketplace, consumers have to believe that you reflect their values and that you're going to do the right thing, as they were saying.
The brands that we see, all the prominent brands, understand this clearly. 10 years ago, CSR was essentially marketing dollars. But now customers, even though there is that disparity, which is, this is really important to me, but I'm still buying this. That's true. But the purchase decision is being influenced to a greater degree today by the values that are exposed, not proposed, by the entities that actually produce these products that we all buy. And so I think that tension, I know, because I talk to a lot of CEOs, that understanding and figuring this out right is number one on their agenda, because their ability to own a market, and I'm not talking about antitrust, I'm talking about owning a consumer market, is wholly predicated on their ability to, over a long time, and in today's world, authentically, be able to go out and say, this is what we're doing. And the good side of social media is false statements, even though journalism has a ton of problems, are exposed in the fact that people don't care about the exposure doesn't change the fact that the counterfactual is out there.
Craig?
I can only speak for myself and the entirety of the community of engineers and programmers and stuff about the guidelines that we're beginning to remember right now. For example, the big one is to treat people like you want to be treated. You kind of forget that, but then if you're lucky, something reminds you of that. With that broad guideline, a good guardrail is don't be evil. Because in the naive idealism of technology people, and I mean the builders, sometimes in our excitement for the technology, we don't consider the unanticipated consequences of that technology. A broader guideline for folks who are using these technologies in platforms and in news is another lesson that I learned in Sunday school: thou shalt not bear false witness. The deal there is, again, don't amplify disinformation. And Twitter today made a significant announcement along these lines. No one quite understands it yet because the devil's in the details, but they are going to start discouraging statements made by prominent individuals who may have a difficult time behaving themselves. So the deal is that the reluctance of my people to stand up and demand their employers do the right thing, that reluctance is now coming to an end. I'm spending a lot of time in quiet back-channel diplomacy encouraging this kind of thing, along with a warning that the people who are good at building things are really crappy at talking about them. Bad actors, people acting in bad conscience, their big skill is talking about things, and they don't care if they're speaking in false witness. And that's the challenge we have, because people like me, we're defenseless against disinformation operatives, and that can't last. So we're taking measures against it.
So,
Yeah, just I don't know if Paul Romer is here, but I had coffee with him this morning, and Paul Romer won the 2018 co-won the 2018 Nobel Laureate for Economics, and was one of the leading proponents of a free market and small government, and he has completely changed his view. And what he told me as a fact base, and picking up on Craig, is that, in fact, over the last 3 years, life expectancy in the United States, relatively uniquely, is declining. And when you think about why that is, it doesn't take very long before you can get to technological innovation, including OxyContin and disentanglement by social media, which is creating all kinds of emotional and social media-driven issues. And so I think this idea that it's hard when you're building innovation to understand the full consequences of what that might be, and in the absence of sovereign responsibility, to at least consider the counterfactual that these kinds of things that are hitting the market at mass scale can have a negative consequence, or even track it, seems to me to be a big gap in our policy.
All right. Last question. I want to hear from each one of you all. 10 years ago in Silicon Valley, the mantra was move fast, break things. What should be the phrase or the mantra going forward in technology as we think about technology as a tool for good? Craig?
I think I've prematurely disclosed my mantra, mostly from Sunday school. Treat people like you want to be treated. Don't be evil. Don't bear false witness.
Well, to me, it's always coming back to storytelling. Tell stories that can make a difference in the world and put them out there in ways that can reach your biggest audience.
Move fast. We don't want to inhibit the innovation of our technology sector, but make a difference.
Yeah, and the problem with that whole go fast, don't break things, how many people would actually fly on a plane while they were building it? Like, none of that stuff makes any sense. So the idea of not doing harm, as Evan said, is a good, and as Craig said, is a good bookend, but it's not enough. It just simply isn't enough. And the reason why it's not enough is because the bad travels so much faster. And I think as many of us know, it's not going to be easy to get this genie back in the box. Yeah. It's already out in the world. It has life. Everything we seem to think we can build and control, we can't. And so I think having a stronger sense of what harm we're inflicting on the world and having a focus on making sure that we control it at least somewhat in the infancy.
Craig, you said something that appealed to me, and maybe it's because I went to Morehouse College and Spike Lee went there, but I like do the right thing. And just there, because the clock hasn't run out, so the shot clock is still good. Evan, talk a little bit about K-12 education, any good tools for good that are taking place?
Yeah, so as I said before, we've spent the last 8 years putting broadband in every public school, and what we're seeing happen as a result of that is real changes of what's going on in the classroom. Now, caveat this, we're in like the second inning, right? Lots of technologies showing up, some are working, some are not working, and more importantly, teachers are still figuring out how to use them. But broadly speaking, I'd say what we're seeing is three critical things happening. So number one is access. Not too long ago, 75% of our high schools didn't have computer science, 40% didn't have physics, 25% didn't have chemistry, and forget about calculus. Technology is breaking those barriers down. It is allowing those things to spread. So access is one. Second is engagement. Unquestionably, we are seeing higher engagement from students once technology is introduced into the classroom in a blended fashion, i.e. there's still teachers there, you're still interacting with your peers, but technology, because that's how they've grown up, that's their world, and so they're engaging more. And then the third thing is personalization. And I don't mean personalization where a computer is plotting every move that you do. Personalization can be as simple as giving teachers the data that they need to know which kid understood last night's homework and which kid didn't in real time, so they can adjust their teaching in real time. And that's a starting point, but that's only going to grow. So I think there's a tremendous number of tools. There's a tremendous amount of innovation that needs to still happen. We're seeing, now that the broadband problem is essentially solved, we're now seeing more and more teachers feel confident in their ability to start experimenting with these things.
Suzan, National Geographic, 130 years.
131.
131. How do you all use technology to continue to advance the trust that you all have really garnered?
Yeah, it's so interesting when you think about trusted brands. All of our surveys show that National Geographic is one of the most trusted and credible brands, and that is such a privilege. And it's probably why everybody tells me they've got 8,000 pounds of National Geographics in the attic or in the basement, and it's because of that reverence for the brand. So the challenge for us, though, is to take the reverence of the brand and move it into the modern age, make sure our content is relevant and that we're reaching people in modern ways with relevant stories, but keeping that trust level. And I think it all goes down to the quality of the storytelling, making sure those stories are fair, that they're global, that they're fact-based, science-based, and they're on the side of the planet. That's what we've always tried to do, and I see no reason to change that. The only thing that's changing is the tools.
And within our portfolio, we have several Nat Geo explorers, two of whom are relying on technology. Sarah Parchak, who's using satellite imagery to preserve cultural heritage sites that are being threatened by climate change, war, conflict, and mobilizing citizen scientists to spend hours looking at satellite images and being able to be trained to identify a cultural site and then work with a country. Another, Greg Trenish of Adventure Scientists, is pooling scientists from around the world, capturing data that's needed by academic institutions around plastic pollution in the ocean, conservation of species. And so in so many ways, that brand translated to explorers around the world utilizing technology, again, is making an enormous difference.
I just have to tell you about this one young guy. He uses cell phones, in the jungle, and he puts them up in trees, and the cell phones can pick up the sound of when people come in there and either start illegally logging or poaching animals. And we've got a situation where 100,000 elephants have been killed in the last 3 years, and rhinos are literally being driven into extinction. So if we can use technology to stop people from doing bad things like that, that is so fantastic. And then what we do on our storytelling side is amplify those stories and get people invested in helping make the world a better place.
I think that's a great one to end on, talking about technology used for tool for good. And with that, I want to thank all of you all and turn it over to Michael.
And it's getting to be the afternoon in Aspen, post-lunch, that's the toughest class, people are falling asleep. So we're going to make this exciting and intellectually caffeinated, all right? So really quick, everyone knows Craig Newmark, he once had a list, I guess, right?
I really could be playing with those puppies now.
Yeah, I understand. Rob Reich, not to be confused with Bob Reich from another institution in Berkeley, but at Stanford, poli-sci department, education adjunct, and runs a center like all good professors. Betsy Cooper from the Aspen newly christened Tech Hub, and then Alex Demos, also at Stanford, Freeman Spogli Institute, and also a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and running a center now too as well, right? I'm Michael Chu. I'm a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey Company's research arm. I want to start, we teach our McKinsey consultants that problem definition is one of the most important things in order to actually make progress. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which we can move forward with tech and trust, or maybe trust in tech, for instance. And so I'd love to go down the line and just hear what is either the biggest problem or the problem that you've chosen to focus on in the near future with regard to trust in tech. And Alex, let's start with you.
Yeah, so my focus for my entire career has been kind of adversarial use of tech to cause harm. Traditionally,
that's a long set of words, meaning
meaning bad guys doing bad things with computers. Yeah, and so bad guys doing bad things with computers used to be kind of constrained to this traditional hacker mindset, breaking into computers, stealing information, and such. And now what we're dealing with is a much broader set of kind of human harms, of bad things that have all happened in the real world, but that are made easier, that happen at larger scale, that are perhaps harder to find bad guys when done online.
Okay.
Can I take a second to respond to Dr. Wu?
I would love that.
I got, I felt like I should get there.
Because your old job.
My old job, I was the chief security officer at Facebook during the Russian investigation. I ran the investigation into Russian interference in 2016. I actually agree with Dr. Wu that there's not enough competition in Silicon Valley. If you look at the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley, it is lined by the bleached skulls of the companies that have come before, right? Like Facebook famously is actually on the Sun campus. Google's on the SGI campus. And that ecosystem has been disrupted by the size of these big companies and their ability to gather data to figure out who their competitors are. But I am going to push back a little bit on the idea that just big is bad. I think there's a lot of tech critics who like the idea that it's easy just to be against these companies and that there's no downsides. The truth is everything you know about Russian interference on Facebook in 2016, everything in the Mueller report, every single thing in there about interference on Facebook, my team found and turned over voluntarily to the government. Government found none of it. We got no help from the US government or any other government really in 2016 and 2017. Some of that changed with 2018. And so we have a massive data sampling issue in that we don't actually know what the Russians did in 2016 because the 1,000 other user-generated content sites, the small companies, don't have ex-NSA Russian-speaking counterintelligence analysts like the team I built going and looking for this stuff. And so it's the same thing with Google and Twitter. So we know about Facebook, Google, and Twitter. We don't know about Reddit and Pinterest and 4chan and 8chan and Gab and Vote and the New York Times comment section and everything else because they don't have professionals looking at it. And so there is a cost to breaking up the companies. There is a true issue here. I don't think that's a reason not to break them up. I think that's a reason to create structures by which a company that is the size of Instagram, a standalone Instagram, has the support necessary to do the right thing. But that is a much more complicated trade-off than just the idea that the big companies are bad. The truth is Facebook has done more than pretty much any other company or organization in the ecosystem, including the government, and especially including the mass media. It has done more to respond to 2016 than anybody else.
So let's come back to this, because some of the work you're doing now is forward-looking about how that could actually happen.
And so I think the company screwed up a lot of things. I made a lot of mistakes, right? I personally made a lot of mistakes, but the tech companies are taking all the crap.
What was your job before Facebook?
I was at Yahoo, which was a lot of fun. But like, we're taking all the hits outside of the context of this being all of society failure, and because the media gets to set the entire conversation, they have moved all of the responsibility onto these tech companies for not controlling other people's speech when the media was absolutely completely played by the GRU in 2016, and they've taken no responsibility for it at all. And so like in that context, it's difficult to have this conversation because the entire trust conversation is somewhat artificial based upon the people who get to set the terms of the debate not taking any responsibility themselves for a significant vulnerability our entire society has to outside manipulation.
All right, so we've got enough for like 4 hours, but we are going to let you all get something, right?
Yeah.
All right, Betsy, what's the biggest problem that you want to attack in trust and tech?
Sure. Well, we heard a lot earlier about engineers feeling very empowered, but also not knowing how to use their power. So the walkout at Wayfair yesterday is an excellent example where we're seeing protests, but people don't know how to harness that energy. And so at the Aspen Institute, we're building a new tech policy hub, training technologists how to engage in the policy process, how to give them a lever other than building technology to engage with the world. So we have 15 technologists based in San Francisco. They've just gone through a pretty intense 2-week boot camp. I just went through 2 weeks of teaching, so apologies if I'm a little tired. But we've had a phenomenal time seeing how their process of thinking through technology can apply to innovative ways to change the world. And so even as early as this week, some of them are coming up with ideas for new commissions on how to improve election security using tools that normally would be used in the hacker environment, for instance. So that's just one small example of how if you empower people to take new tools on, they can come up with new innovations. And
so let me ask, so Craig once, just moments ago, spoke for all of us who ever worked on a command line and wrote code and all those sorts of things. And what you're suggesting is, and Craig, you mentioned it too, there are people who want to do good, but Kara Swisher says they have no training in understanding any of those things. Is that the problem you're describing?
Exactly, that's the problem we're solving, and we're bringing new people into that, and we have cohorts. We're set up like an incubator, so we can bring people through in perpetuity.
All right. Rob, what's the big problem you see ahead of us that you want to focus on?
Yeah. What Betsy just describes a perfect lead into what I want to say, which is that I work at a university that is the seedbed for a lot of the tech innovation in Silicon Valley, and of course that trains many of the people who go to work and found these companies. So the approach that I want to take is similar to what Betsy just described, but located within a university. One of the things that's astonishing right now at Stanford is that in the past 5 years, students have voted with their feet to begin to major in computer science in record numbers. Commencement at Stanford happened 2 weeks ago. Almost 1 in 2 males was a computer science graduate 2 weeks ago, and 1 of every 3 women graduates, female graduates, computer science major. You can get through the computer science major, which is a hard major, but without any systematic exposure to the humanities or social sciences. So what I'm trying to do is to build out...
Is that true?
Very little.
Yeah, not systematic, right?
Not systematic.
Okay.
I mean, the kind of only slightly caricature I have about this is There is a class called Computers, Ethics, and Public Policy. When it's taught by a computer science professor, it consists of coding, problem sets, and then a Wired article, apologies to Nick, about autonomous driving and the trolley problem. And then you make a few gestures at an ethical issue about building autonomous vehicles. A philosopher can sometimes teach a class on ethics and technology, and you get 3 weeks of John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, 3 weeks of Immanuel Kant and deontology, and then the same Wired article about the trolley problem. Both of those are terrible approaches to teaching engineers or public policy people or philosophers. You need an integrated, interdisciplinary approach. This is what universities are good for. One last example. I'm now part of this new thing at Stanford called the Institute for Human-Centered AI. It's led by one of the world's best AI researchers named Fei-Fei Li. And the whole goal is to ensure that at the forefront of AI and its development, it's done in tandem with people who are world-class humanists and world-class social scientists. And will try to be a magnet to draw AI talent out of industry back into an academy, a nonprofit university research setting, in which you can have some of the compute power, some of the data, not the salary you'd get at Google or Facebook. But the appeal is to the technologist who says, I'd like to build things by working with some of the best economists, psychologists, political scientists, philosophers in the world, which you're not going to get if you're working at Google or Facebook.
So arguably, same problem that Betsy's describing, right? If Larry Lessig says, law is code, and
right.
your universities are producing law, but it's a different cohort, right? People who are graduating, Betsy's people who are mid-career or something like that.
And we're not just focused on ethics. We're really trying to give them practical tools so they can build something in the policy space.
Yep.
So we want them to build operational plans, mock legislation or regulations, digital toolkits for consumers, display of artwork, whatever it can be to best influence the stakeholders. And we want to take them out into the world and have them share that with the actual people that they can engage with.
Got it.
I think we'll be the perfect ground for your graduates to come on over to our program.
Right over to you.
All right, collaboration at Aspen Ideas. That's excellent. Craig, you've done lots of things, and now you're doing lots of new things, investing, they're pigeons, but all kinds of interesting things.
Well,
talk about what are the biggest problems in trust and tech you want to go after with all your activities now.
in the long term, big challenge is to remind the builders to think about the unintended consequences of what they're doing, like to support the Responsible for Computer Science challenge, which is building ethical training into computer science curricula. And that's beginning to happen right now at major computer science schools around the country. I think Stanford may be one of them. I wish I could remember everything that's going on, but I can't. That's not going to happen. For additional training, frankly, I'd recommend some of the works of Chidi Anagonye, who is a professor of ethics at St. John's University. And if anyone gets that joke, thank you. In the broader sense, right now, our country is under attack by foreign and domestic adversaries who wish us harm. That attack is not so much kinetic, but it is informational. It is ongoing right now through journalism, through the attack of computer systems. This is being done by people who know a lot more than I do about it. So when it comes to ethical training or the development of those defenses, the deal is to support the people who are doing it, both in government and privately. In 1970, there was a guy who said that World War III would be a guerrilla information war fought equally by military and civilian components. That was Marshall McLuhan. And I'm not very smart, and that's the only thing I've ever understood that he said. But that's what's happening in the here and now. So if I was a really smart guy, I would be supporting ethical efforts at places like Stanford. I would be supporting tech policy efforts, let's say at Aspen, and I would be supporting the analysis of foreign and domestic efforts at Stanford. I should go about doing that someday.
Funny counterfactual, okay.
But it would be unprofessional to announce things prematurely. Also, some of the efforts involved people are at physical jeopardy, so one should stop talking.
Because pre-announcements never happen in tech. Okay, Alex, while you're pouring yourself a drink, love to hear.
Just water?
What, as far as we know, what actions are you taking to address this problem of bad people or good people doing bad things that are affecting our ability to trust?
Yeah, so we're creating this new thing called the Stanford Internet Observatory. Our goal is to have interventions on research, policy, and teaching. So on the research side, the first publication that we've done from the overall Cyber Policy Center is we just published a report.
Does it look like this?
Oh my goodness, you brought it? Thank you so much. We brought this is 45 recommendations on what the United States should do to protect the 2020 election. There's basically 4 different kinds of Russian attack in 2016. We don't have time to go into all of it, but we try to address all the different kinds of issues, including recommendations for the tech companies, including regulation of the tech companies, regulation of political ads, regulation of the RTs and Sputniks of the world, how to adapt FARA, stuff like that. So this is our first publication trying to do this kind of stuff. We're building a observatory to watch activity online. A lot of our focus will honestly not be in the West in the United States. Like you've got NSA, FBI, the entire media ecosystem watching for chicanery in the United States. There have been a dozen elections in Africa since 2016 in which something weird has happened online. It comes out, there's a company in Israel that is selling Russian-style disinformation as a service to autocrats in sub-Saharan Africa. Right, that's the kind of stuff we need to pay attention to. I think the first big one for us will be Taiwan 2020, January.
Is it Black Sphere? Is that it?
Black Cube is the name of that company, but no, it's a different evil-sounding company name. Totally different, yeah, there's several there. And then the third thing we're trying to do on the educational side is to take the things we learn and to feed it back. So just like Professor Risch, a real professor, I'm a fake professor. The word adjunct is fake in Latin.
Not in Greek.
Yeah, not in Greek, no. It's just like they're training in kind of ethical thought, the thing I would like to teach students is to not make the same mistakes my generation made. So we're teaching a trust and safety engineering class, which is basically all of the bad things that happen online. So we're talking about account takeovers, fraud, 419 scams, the scams where people take over accounts and then pretend to be under arrest in Mexico, send me money, those kinds of scams, the sexual abuse of children, which is actually the worst thing that happens online every day. So we're gonna have a whole 2 units on that, misinformation, disinformation, terrorism, suicide, and self-harm. So effectively, immerse these students in all the bad things that happen, because the truth is Stanford students have generally lived pretty awesome lives and have not seen those downsides, and then we're open sourcing that content. I have 20 people from Silicon Valley helping create it. UT Austin has a great CS department, but they can't get the head of child safety from Microsoft to come, work on stuff there. And so we're going to open source all the content and try to get other universities to teach it as well. But I think we have to expose young people to what has gone wrong in the past, so that one, they cannot make the same mistakes, but also they have an adversarial mindset. And that's what Silicon Valley has to do overall, is we have to realize that there are intelligent adversaries with the goal of doing harm on the other side of all of these products. And so we have to think adversarially, not just building the products as we want them to be used, but building them with the expectation they'll be used to cause harm, with a diverse set of people who understand the different kinds of harm that can happen.
Just to pause, what does it mean to have an internet observatory? What's an internet telescope look like?
Right, so effectively, part of the problem, there's all this great quantitative social and political scientists who have difficulty studying what's going on the internet because the activation energy for them of figuring out India and Pakistan had a big dust up a couple months ago, right?
You just use quantum physics to talk to political scientists. Can you?
I'm saying there's quantitative social scientists, but the amount of work they have to do to study what's going on in India and Pakistan on Twitter is they have to have a PhD student who writes Python. They have to sign an API agreement. They have to build a data repository. They have to do all this work. Astronomers don't build their own telescopes, right? Stanford does not have its own space telescope. Stanford astronomers go rent time on the Hubble and the Arecibo and such. And so we're going to build one set of quantitative tools. We're going to do the agreements with the companies once, which is a huge pain. There's real legal issues here. Cambridge Analytica happened at a really bad time for academics, because the tech companies have all of the incentives for them is to never share data with academics ever again.
So why in the heck
so we're going to try to fix that. Well, because it's the right thing to do, and because In the long run, somebody has to look over their shoulders that they're doing a reasonably good job and to qualify that in public. And we also probably need Congress, and we especially need the European Data Protection Authorities to create carve-outs for academic research. But that's a different issue. So we're going to build all the infrastructure once and then provide it to real professors, like Professor Reisch, to then be able to do their study of what's going on online, and then we can support them in doing that work, our technologists.
Do you have evidence that the tech companies are actually going to let you peer into their
We're actually
data?
down the road with a bunch of them. I mean, there's a tension here between the people. All of the big tech companies, again, have like PhDs who study these issues and who want to work with academia. They are fighting against the privacy lawyers for whom anything where any data ever leaves is a bad thing because it might get them in privacy problem. The other issue we have just globally is privacy laws kept on getting passed, but no safety laws, right? And so effectively,
what's the difference between privacy and safety?
Oh, well, safety is trying to prevent people from using the technology to cause harm. That is directly opposed to knowing nothing about people, right? So this is actually one of the hard trade-offs, is you can't expect a tech company to find the 500 spies out of 200 people if they know nothing about people, right? And so we're barreling towards this world where the privacy laws are passing, but not the requirements for the companies to look out for people's safety. And so the easy thing for the companies to do is just to throw all the data away, encrypt everything, and never again have any responsibility for safety, which I think is actually a really bad thing, but that is what effectively the Europeans have said and some people in Congress are saying. Yeah.
I just want to add there. I mean, so one of the things that's been said on the panel so far earlier as well is that one of the mottos perhaps should be do the right thing, which is a sensible way to approach thinking about technology in certain respects. But what Alex just described is a great example, it seems to me, why ethics and policy needs to be brought to bear, because it's not always obvious what the right thing is, and people can have reasonable disagreements about how to weight privacy over security. So if Mark Zuckerberg announces that he's going to take the technology behind WhatsApp, end-to-end encrypted messages, and apply that now across the entire platform, or at least much of it, then neither the company nor any outside person will be able to read the content of those messages, and then that compromises safety in certain ways, because if the content of the messages is something that's harmful to the people who are on the receiving end, no one knows about it. And that's a great example of the sort of value trade-off that somewhere is going to be struck. And if the only people making those decisions, in my view, are the people inside the technology companies themselves who haven't been educated in ways to take the social science and the ethics to think about hard value trade-offs, we're giving all of the power to the engineers and the developers to make these hugely consequential decisions that bear on all of us in really profound ways.
In very non-transparent ways.
And just to add, though, that's why policy can no longer be thought of as just government. In this space, companies are setting policy on issues such as antitrust, on issues such as data privacy, on issues such as security, as much as governments are. It's government's choice whether to up the ante, but we can never go back to a world where it's just government that makes policy, and we need to expand our thinking on
Facebook and Google have defined what the political ad laws are in the United States because Congress has not acted. So they had to do it on their own.
And in terms of arrests, we're still using Computer Fraud and Abuse Act from the 1980s. Guess what? Computers have changed since the 1980s, but our laws haven't.
So Betsy, talk more about it, right? I mean, I think we'll come back to education, but how are you thinking about bringing these technologists in who arguably are incompetent in the area of policy? How do you turn them into competent? And then what happens to these poor people?
Ouch.
Well, so first, they start from a process where they come in and we assume they know nothing. We give them a really detailed curriculum on the policy process, how to define a problem, how to map out important stakeholders both in government and outside, how to brainstorm alternative solutions, and how to go through a systematic process to select those solutions. By the way, a lot of this is very familiar to technologists. They go through similar processes in their day jobs. They've just never thought about applying it to this sort of system. Then we give them a bunch of really practical training. So we've worked actually with a number of organizations to get real-world problems that need to be solved. So for instance, our fellows did not just write a memo in the ether and have me edit their memo and give it back to them so they could see what a policy memo is right. We worked to get a real-life commission that is studying a real-life problem, and all of their memos were delivered directly to that commission so the commission could actually consider those ideas. They're going to do a 48-hour project in partnership with one of the local cities trying to solve problems. So they're getting real-life experience with stakeholders. And then they spend the bulk of their time building a final project. They get to decide what that is. We help them get mentors. We give them support, whether it be copy editors, web designers, legal advice sometimes, whatever they need in order to build that project. And then they exit our incubator not by pitching to funders like they would in a normal startup incubator, but by pitching to actual decision makers, whether they be in government or in industry or both, so that they can actually share those ideas. So what we hope we get are new ideas, new, more practical outputs, as I mentioned before, but perhaps most importantly, this backbench of people who now speak technology, speak policy, can help translate between the two, and can help bring the conversation bridging Silicon Valley and DC forward.
And you've described Tech Hub as being like Y Combinator, but for tech policy folks. But let me pause for a moment. I want to pull on a thread that you mentioned, which is that the problem-solving methodology you just described is one that technologists say they do to solve tech problems. And actually, this is, I think we're all living in the Bay Area, right? This is like Bay Area mountain version. But tech bros walk around all the time, and they think they're really smart, and they think they can solve any problem, and they think that they can bring their tech problem solving to any problem in the world, including policy. So is there any mindset shift that has to happen as these people come in and say, hey, oh yeah, we do this all the time?
So I totally thought there would be. It's been amazing, actually. They are in this program because they're not sure technology can do anything. So I actually had a whole speech prepared about how technology is not the solution you always want to go to, and I had to ditch it and actually say, no, technology can sometimes be a solution you can consider. Don't create another multi-stakeholder commission. We have enough of those, So it's been an interesting process, but I think what they will say is that the mental map is similar, but the language is different. For any of you who have gone to law school or to business school, when you first walk into a program, you're learning an entirely new language, a new way of approaching things. So while the process map may be similar, we're building a whole new layer of tools on top of that. And I think all of them would say it's kind of overwhelming, but it's also really interesting.
Yeah. To stand up for the nerds a bit, the least ethical people I've ever worked with had fancy MBAs and JDs from Ivy League schools. So it's not just like teaching the nerds some philosophy. I think we have to change the overall incentive structure for the tech companies to get them there.
Are MBAs fancy? All right, we'll come back to that. Rob, you had asserted people who are graduate technology degrees don't have a structured education in the humanities and social sciences. What should be put in place?
Well, consider this as an analogy. About 70 or 80 years ago, a couple generations ago, you could create new pharmaceutical ideas, innovations, and go test them out in ways in which you didn't have to go through an IRB at a university, the kinds of FDA trials that you have to run. This whole apparatus has been built out in the wake of World War II, and some real scandals, like the Tuskegee experiments, for example. There's no equivalent within schools of engineering. If you go to a school of medicine and you want to build some new biomedical innovations, you're going to get exposed to bioethics. You're going to have to go through institutional review boards. You're going to have to learn how the FDA wants to regulate things. Now, I'm not saying those are perfect remedies, but I'm just suggesting how wholly absent they are from a school of engineering. There's no equivalent for data scientists of an IRB. There's no equivalent of an ethics infrastructure in which you'd have an ethics committee at a hospital. Nowadays, tech companies are beginning to build out ethics committees, but it feels very reactive at the moment rather than something that's been planned and deliberate. So what I have in mind is something like what you can imagine exists within schools of medicine, now in schools of engineering. And there's another plan afoot that Betsy and lots of other people here will know about too, to take some lessons from law schools and apply those within schools of engineering. So a couple generations ago, there was an effort to build out something called public interest law, in which you would take people who got law degrees and you would try to develop them in such a way that they could go be public interest lawyers, you could work in civil society organizations, or perhaps work for the government. Nowadays, engineers have very few pathways out of being a CS major into a civil society organization or a nonprofit. Almost all of them go to work for a tech company for reasons that we can all understand. Maybe we also need a public interest technology movement within schools of engineering so that what happened a couple generations ago in law schools can now also happen in schools of engineering.
All right. We're going to the lightning round. I mean, Fred had one too, but we're going to have our own. You ready? Quick questions, quick answers. Alex, we're going to start with you.
Yeah.
What's your favorite source of information about trust and technology?
Oh, God. Pass.
Betsy.
Is that an option?
Lawfare blog.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Wired.
I've been reading science fiction for 60 years.
All right, that's good. Craig, what's your favorite metric for evaluating trustworthiness?
Do they have a written code of ethics, and do they follow it?
Rob.
Do they do the right thing when no one's looking?
Betsy.
Do they care about doing good?
Is this for media? I was going to say then that they're actually upfront with what their biases are.
What gives you the most hope about positive change in trust and technology, Alex?
The students who come to me asking me how they can have positive impact in their career.
Betsy.
The dramatic change just in the past 2 years. Silicon Valley and DC are moving closer together finally, so I think the curve is going in the right direction. You may disagree.
That the bloom is off the rose of Silicon Valley, and now we have to reckon with the power of technologists.
That the people I speak to at platforms want to do the right thing and be in a good place.
Craig, what gives you, what worries you most about trust and technology?
That right now the bad actors are far more persuasive than good actors.
Rob.
Technology innovation always outpaces regulation.
Betsy.
That Twitter is where our politics is happening.
Tim was right. We have a completely mismatched government law enforcement structure to what is actually causing harm online.
If you weren't working on what you're currently working on, what would you be doing in trust and technology, Alex?
I mean, like, I quit my job and took it to do this. So this is what I want to do. Yeah.
What if you were fired again?
I wasn't.
He wasn't fired.
There's different levels of fired. I mean, I would probably start a company. I think we're missing startups who focus on trust and safety. If you have a problem with like neo-Nazis, if you get broken into, you have people you can call. If you have a problem with neo-Nazis, there's nobody you can call. We need to create startups that actually provide services in this area.
Ghostbusters. Okay.
I'd go work in government if I thought it would matter right now.
Rob.
Find a way to break the material that I've been developing and teaching at Stanford to provide to people who are outside of Stanford.
Craig.
Doing everything I can. I'd probably have to go into a puppy rescue.
Other than your own,
consistent.
Other than your own, which company or organization is doing the most to contribute to improving trust and tech? Other than your own,
could you repeat that?
Yeah, other than your own organization, which company or organization is contributing most to positive change in trust and tech? Craig.
The Stanford Internet Observatory.
Yeah.
I'm hurt.
The Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Oh, this is hard. There's too many. I'll pass.
I think what Betsy's doing is great. I like Access Now as well because they have an international focus.
Which elected official?
Can I just add one, which is just to say impact litigation generally, which was the theme here, is incredibly important. I can't pick one organization, but the lawsuits are what's keeping things moving.
Wow. Which elected official is most knowledgeable about trust and technology issues? Alex.
Currently elected official?
Yes.
Oof. I mean, the smartest person was Rob Joyce. He got fired out of the White House. He's like in England, basically in chains somewhere.
Also not elected.
Not
Sorry,
elected.
we're going to have
So,
to
yeah,
do
he's
government
appointed.
101.
What do you, yeah, thank you.
Is that a pass?
I mean, the only person in Congress who has any tech background is Will Hurd.
Ted Lieu.
Ted Lieu.
Betsy?
I would have said Will Hurd.
Don't know.
Could be Will Hurd.
All right. What advice do you have for people watching who want to contribute to trust and tech? What advice do you have for people watching who want to contribute to trust and tech?
Make sure you're talking to people who actually know what they're talking about.
Rob.
Trust less in technologists and trust more in the democratic processes.
Betsy.
Find engineers and startup founders and let me train them.
Decide what you want tech companies to do and what powers you want them to have before you ask them to fix things.
Right. Please thank our panel.